Thank you so much, Patrizio, and I hope we can be on a first name basis as colleagues, as we are colleagues in the professorial world, the academic world, and also colleagues in the civil liberties, human rights, activism world. So Patrizio, it's the first time I meet you in person, but I feel as if we're friends and colleagues. And I'd also like to thank Giorgio and Mattia, who are very helpful in setting this up. And most of all, thanks to the students and members of the audience. As an American, I'm so impressed that you know English well enough. We in the United States are so spoiled because around the world, everybody speaks English, and so we become lazy and don't learn beautiful other languages such as Italian, although I'm a real fan of Italian opera. So, you know, if the word comes from an opera, I would recognize it. I also want to say on a personal note, my family background is partly Italian, as is true for many Americans. My grandmother on my mother's side was actually born in Italy, in a small village outside of Naples, so not too far from Rome, which is one of my very favorite cities in the whole world. I envy you living there, and I look forward to my next opportunity to visit in person. I've also read about your impressive university and your impressive law school. I read that your color is blue, so I'm wearing blue to show my respect for you, but I thank you for having such a beautiful color. I would have worn it whatever it is, but I'm happy that it's blue. Now, as Patrizio indicated, the topic that you asked me to address, which is the main subject of my most recent book, is a very current, very hot topic, but it is also one of perennial, enduring concern throughout history and around the world. I especially look forward to answering your questions and comments during the last part of our time together. But before that, I am going to make three major interrelated points. And first, I will summarize them briefly, and then I will go back and elaborate on all of them. So my first point is that we do not have to choose between resisting hate, and again, that's the main title of my book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It. My main message is an anti-hate message. We don't have to choose between resisting hate and resisting censorship. I fully share the goals of those who advocate censoring hate speech. Namely, they say this censorship will promote equality and dignity, diversity, inclusivity, societal harmony, individual well-being, and psychic and emotional health for those who are disparaged by hate speech. I could not support those goals more wholeheartedly. However, I am convinced, based on extensive research and experience from the actual impact of censorial laws, that no matter how well intended they are, they actually do more harm than good. And let me have a footnote here, because I've talked about censorship and resisting censorship to hate speech. I want to explain how I am using that word, because the term censorship, at least in US law and in international human rights law, which I'm also very familiar with, the term censorship is not a legal term of art. So let me tell you how I am using the term. I am using it to refer to any suppression of speech by the government or by another powerful actor that goes beyond permissible limits on speech under the US Constitution or under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So one of the points I will amplify on is I don't believe that speech is absolutely, completely, categorically protected no matter what. But I think the strict limits on government censorship power under First Amendment law and international law are appropriate. And when we go beyond that, no matter how well intended, it does not help advance the goals of equality and so forth. And so that brings me to my second interrelated point, which I've already touched on, which is that censorship of hate speech, again, using that term as going beyond permitted suppression under First Amendment law, censorship is at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive. And when I say counterproductive, well, Patrizio already alluded to this important point, that disproportionately, consistently, censorship laws against hate speech adversely affect the voices and the protests and the causes of precisely the traditionally marginalized and disempowered minority groups that are hoped to be benefited by the laws. And this has been the consistent experience throughout history around the world. We still see it today on social media. Again, I will elaborate on that second point later, but let me proceed to my introduction to my third interrelated point, and that is that non-censorial measures to deal with these underlying problems of hatred and discrimination and stereotyping, non-censorial measures are at least as effective as censorship, if not more so. And let me quickly list some of the non-censorial measures. One is anti-discrimination laws that are vigorously enforced, outlawing actual discriminatory conduct, especially in important sectors of society such as education, housing, employment. Second is laws against what are sometimes called hate crimes or bias crimes. And let me explain what that concept is, because a lot of people in my country confuse the term hate speech with the term hate crime. Hate crime is an action that is independently punishable as a crime, that is independent of any idea or expression which the perpetrator engages in. An assault against a person, a physical attack against a person, or vandalism of a building. The United States Supreme Court has held that if the victim of such a crime is intentionally singled out by the perpetrator for a discriminatory reason, it can be considered a hate crime or a biased crime, which receives a heavier sentence on the theory that it does more harm both to the individual and to society as a whole. So if somebody assaults a trans person because of discrimination against trans people, that can be punished as a more serious crime than a non-discriminatory assault. Likewise, if a synagogue or a mosque is vandalized because of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, that can be treated and punished more severely as a so-called hate crime. Another important strategy. And third is a third non-censorial strategy that is at least as effective, if not more so, than censorship, is what we often call counter speech. And I will say a lot more about that later on, because it's a concept that's not nearly as well understood as it should be. But basically it means using our freedom of speech in any way that we can to counter or refute or reduce the discriminatory ideas that are expressed through hate speech. Okay, so that's an overview of my 3 major points. And again, to summarize them, we don't have to choose between resisting hate and resisting censorship, point number 1. Point number 2, no matter how well intended, censorship of hate speech is at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive, especially harming the rights of minority groups. And number 3, there are non-censorial measures that can do the job of advancing equality at least as effectively, if not more so, than censorship laws. So for these reasons alone, censorship should be opposed even apart from First Amendment principles. Notice that all of the points that I've made are not based on legal philosophy, certainly not based on rules of law, either in the United States or elsewhere. I'm making universal points that are based on inherent universal concerns about human rights. I guess that is partly a matter of philosophy. For me as an activist, it's also very much a matter of lived experience and demonstrated effective strategies. And I stress that these principles are universal because I want to stress that they apply in contexts that go far beyond the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which contains our famous freedom of speech guarantee. That means these principles apply in other countries that don't have the same constitutional protection for free speech. And these principles also apply in the private sphere where the First Amendment does not apply. And please forgive me, I'm completely ignorant about your Constitution. I wish I could sit in on one of Patrizio's or Giorgio's classes and learn about it. So I'm not sure if you have the equivalent principle under your Constitution, but the US Constitution only applies to the government. Government officials, government agencies at every level of government, state, local, and federal, are bound by the First Amendment free speech guarantee to respect free speech rights of the rest of us. But if you are a private sector individual or a private sector company, we lawyers use the term private sector actor, you're not constrained by the Constitution at all. That is why, by the way, way back in 1964, the United States finally passed the historic Civil Rights Act that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, gender, religion, and so forth in restaurants, hotels, housing, employment. Why was that necessary when our Constitution protected equal protection of the law? Again, because the Constitution only said government can't discriminate on the basis of race. So if we want to protect against private sector conduct that would be unconstitutional if the government engaged in it, we can't rely on the Constitution. So that's why, again, I stress that these principles that I have recited and introduced you to and will be elaborating on are universal, and in my view, they should apply also to private sector entities, including private universities. And where we, in the United States, we have a lot of restrictions on free speech. These principles certainly should apply to at least the tech giants, the giant social media platforms that have so much power and are so important as a source of information and exchange of ideas, that for all practical purposes, if we don't have meaningful free speech rights there, we don't have meaningful free speech rights at all. So again, I'm stressing the universality of these points, that they do not derive from First Amendment free speech constitutional law. So let me summarize that point. Here's the way I like to summarize it. It is that censorship is wrong, not because it is inconsistent with some First Amendment principles in the abstract, but rather the First Amendment principles are right because they outlaw the speech that does cause the most harm, while they also outlaw the censorship that causes the most harm. And I will outline those First Amendment principles later. But I support the First Amendment principles not because they happen to be written into the First Amendment. I have great respect for much, not all, of the work of the founding fathers. They were all fathers in those days, but not absolute idolatry. I respect them because I think the guarantee that they framed, and more importantly, as it has been interpreted by the United States Supreme Court much more recently, is consistent with what I think should be universal principles of liberty, equality, and justice. In other words, I think these principles make just plain common sense. So again, I support these principles not because they happen to be consistent with the First Amendment, but rather I support the First Amendment as it's been interpreted because it's consistent with these universal principles. Okay, before amplifying, I wanted to inject a personal note because I bring to this subject not only great intellectual passion, but also personal passion. And I do think that it's we should acknowledge our personal predilections and investments, because all in particular topics, none of us can be, and maybe we shouldn't be, objective. So my entire personal life, as well as my entire professional life, has been dedicated to human rights as far back as I can remember, even before I knew the terminology. I just had an intuitive belief that all of us, by virtue of being human, are entitled to certain fundamental rights fully and equally. And that belief has certainly been increased as I grew older and learned about the terrible deprivations of human rights that people have suffered, are suffering, were suffering in my country and around the world, and including my own family. And let me, because it's such a salient example, let me tell you about my father's side of the family, which is from Germany. As my husband said when he met me, and I told him, you know, my mother is partly Italian and partly Croatian, and my father is partly German and partly Swedish, you know, and there's Italian there, and there's Jewish there, and atheism. And my husband said to me, my husband, who was born in Jerusalem and grew up in Europe, he said to me, "Oh, you're a typical American, all mixed up." And to me, that is one of the wonderful things about our country, and you know, people come here because of support for the ideals to which we aspire, even recognizing that we are, of course, far away from accomplishing them. My father came here as a refugee from Nazi Germany after World War II. He was born in Berlin in 1922 as what, under Hitler's pernicious racist Nuremberg laws, my father was classified as a Jew of the second degree. His mother was Jewish and his father was not. For that crime, as well as for the fact that he was extremely active in anti-Hitler political movements, even as a teenager. I'm so amazingly proud of him for having done that. For that double reason, he was thrown into the Buchenwald forced labor camp. When he went in there, he was young enough and healthy enough that he was not immediately condemned to death. But as you probably know, the Nazis' forced labor camps were deliberately designed to work people to death. It was a slower form of intentional murder than the gas chambers, but the goal was the same. Forgive my terrible German pronunciation. My father never wanted me to learn German for reasons you can understand. So I'll butcher the pronunciation, but the term was Zerstörung durch Arbeit, destroying people through work and through malnutrition and, horrible backbreaking, crushing labor. And he almost died of the rampant malnutrition, starvation, and disease. To add to that, the Nazis were practicing not only genocide, but also eugenocide. And my father, as a double undesirable, literally had an appointment to be sterilized. And one day before he was going to be sterilized, Buchenwald was liberated by Americans. Every time I tell that story, I still get chills. I absolutely loathe Nazism, not only in the abstract and for what it did to millions of people, but also for the devastating impact in my own family and my husband's family, I might add. So let me tell you, if I believed that censoring hate speech would have been an effective way to prevent Hitler's rise to power, would have prevented genocide in Germany, I would absolutely support it. And let me tell you, that's consistent with First Amendment principles. I told you that the First Amendment is not, and free speech is not absolute. I don't know even the most fervent free speech supporter, myself, Anthony Romero, the United States Supreme Court, none of us has ever said that free speech is absolutely always protected. No. The legal principle, which is also reflected in international human rights law, is that government may censor speech if, but only if, the censorship is necessary and the least speech restrictive means available to promote a countervailing goal of compelling importance. So in other words, if censoring the Nazis' expression could have prevented their rise to power, not only would I support that, but even more importantly, international human rights law would support it, and American free speech law would support it. But that is not what the historical record showed. And let me tell you, because many people are unfamiliar with this, in the Weimar Republic, during which Hitler rose to power, there were very strict anti-hate speech laws, which were very strictly enforced, including against many Nazis who were convicted and served time in prison. Obviously, that did not stop their rise to power. And like many people today who are, there are very few today who are advocating genocide, so I don't mean to make the comparison that directly, but white supremacists and white nationalists in the United States today welcome the attention they get when they are charged with offensive speech, and they get attention they otherwise never would have. They get sympathy they otherwise never would have. And so in the Weimar Republic, the Nazis actually welcomed the prosecutions to which they were subject under the hate speech laws at the time, as they used it as a propaganda platform. And the reason why they were successful in rising to power. It had nothing to do with free speech. In fact, if anything, it was the absence of meaningful free speech for their political opponents. Why? Because the Nazis were getting away with murder, literally. They were engaging in physical violence, assaults and even murders of their political opponents, of socialists, of communists, of members of the military, police forces, and minority groups. And that's why, again, it goes back to one of the points I made about what are the effective ways to deal with hatred, and one of them is enforcing laws against actual discriminatory conduct, including discriminatory violence and crime. And let me just, using the example of Germany, because I think all of us use that as kind of a touchstone, right? The Holocaust was so horrible that if we could have prevented that through censorship, then doesn't that prove that censorship is a good thing? Carrying the story forward to today, I follow the situation in Germany very, very closely. And as you probably know, Germany continues to have very strict anti-hate speech laws that are very strictly enforced, not only in general, but in the more recent past in cyberspace in particular. Germany passed, and in the beginning of 2018 started enforcing one of the most strict anti-hate speech laws online in the world, the so-called NetzDG law. And have we seen a quelling of discriminatory hate speech or hateful conduct in Germany? It's impossible to prove a counterfactual, so in all good conscience, I have to tell you, maybe the situation would have been even worse without these laws, but the situation is certainly not one that I envy, even as an American, recognizing all of the problems we have in this country with violence and discriminatory violence. But you follow the news, you know about the brutal assaults in recent years in Germany against Jews, against synagogues, against refugees, against immigrants, against politicians who are advocating their rights. Even one has been assassinated, and we know that these problems are infecting even the military and even police in Germany. It's such a serious problem, and again, because of my family example, I will use anti-Semitism, but it's just one of many kinds of hatred and hateful violence that are too rampant in Germany. 2 years ago, for the very first time in German history, Chancellor Angela Merkel felt that she had to appoint a cabinet-level minister on anti-Semitism, because the anti-Semitism had gotten so rampant, not only in speech, but also in physical assaults and attempted, and in some cases, successful murders. And last 2 years ago, that a cabinet level official, along with the leader of the coalition of Jewish groups in Germany, issued a statement warning Jewish men in Germany that it is not safe everywhere in Germany to go out in public wearing the yarmulke, the skull cap that many observant religious Jewish men believe they have a religious obligation to wear, because there were so many attacks on men who self-identified as Jewish by wearing the yarmulke, including in Berlin. We're talking about, the crossroads of Europe. I love Berlin. So let's not delude ourselves that we can solve the problems of rampant discrimination and hatred, even with such extremely strict anti-hate speech laws as we see in Germany. And I want to stress that in my book, which was appreciatedly mentioned, I don't want to be the quintessential ugly American who's preaching to the rest of the world what you ought to do. Exactly the opposite. My book is filled with quotations from arguments by points made by human rights activists from countries all over the world. They themselves critiquing their own country's hate speech laws, and same thing with international human rights experts. So when I'm speaking now, not in my own voice, but I am reporting to you the accounts that and the reports that I read from human rights activists all over the world. So since I've been talking about Germany, let me quote one German human rights champion, free speech champion. Her name is Anna Sauerbry. She's the editor of the German newspaper Der Tagesspiegel. And she said, "The American way of dealing with Nazism always seemed to me the more mature way of handling threats to liberal democracy. Germany's outlawing of hate speech seems like a permanent declaration of distrust in argument and education. I have faith in the democratic public's ability to police itself. I wish Germany did." Now, I want to expand briefly on the First Amendment principles I summarized, and I will just have a parenthetical that these principles are mirrored by international human rights free speech law under Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which has been ratified by has been supported, not technically ratified by all of them, although by many, but acceded to in various ways by almost every country in the world. I'm not going to go back and explain the details, but I just want you to have that in mind. And if anybody's interested, I just wrote a very scholarly law review article that compares the treatment specifically of hate speech under United Nations law with US law. And contrary to most people's assumptions that the United States is such an exceptionalist, it's not true. It is, we are very different from the domestic law of many other countries, including European countries. We are very different from the regional law under the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. But interestingly enough, the international law under United Nations treaties and how those treaties have been interpreted by United Nations experts and official bodies with authority to interpret those treaties is much more similar to American law. And I think that's very interesting because we're dealing with tech giants that operate globally. And recently, you may know, the International Rapporteur for Free Speech at the United Nations several years ago recommended that the tech giants should adhere to the international free speech standards around the world. And I think that's a very interesting and viable suggestion. So bearing in mind that there are analogs in the international UN law, let me tell you that First Amendment law revolves around two cardinal principles. It's a very complex body of law, but it's not really an oversimplification to say it all comes down to two principles. One governs when government may not censor speech, and the other one tells you when government may suppress speech. So the non-censorship principle is usually called viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. And that means that government must remain neutral toward the viewpoint, the content, the message, the idea of the speech. No matter how objectionable, offensive, hated, or hateful that message is perceived as being, even by the vast majority of people in this country. Dislike of the message, the content alone, is never enough to justify censorship. If you hate the idea, you have to respond to it with your own idea, or by ignoring it, or by educating the speaker. More speech rather than less speech. That's the non-censorial principle. But the second complementary principle, and I already alluded to it, is often called the emergency principle, and it goes beyond the content of the speech, its hateful or its hated message. And it looks at the context, the facts and circumstances, the setting in which the speech occurs. And that principle is, if in a particular situation, the speech directly causes or directly threatens certain specific, imminent, serious harm, and there's no other way to prevent that harm other than suppressing the speech, then the speech can and should be suppressed. The speech presents an emergency. And the Supreme Court has recognized several categories of speech that will satisfy the emergency exception, which hate speech often does. And by the way, I'm using the term hate speech. I should have a parenthetical here. That's not a constitutional law term of art. The United States Supreme Court has never recognized a category of speech defined by its hateful content and said, therefore, it's not protected under the First Amendment, right? That would violate this viewpoint neutrality, content neutrality principle that I've been talking about. In fact, the Supreme Court repeatedly, consistently, with all of the justices agreeing, despite all of their differences, from the most liberal to the most conservative, consistently have refused to make a hate speech exception to the general viewpoint neutrality principle. But going to the emergency principle, if hate speech, and I use that term the way most of us use it in everyday speech, speech that conveys a hateful or discriminatory or stereotyped idea about an individual or about a group, typically groups that have traditionally been marginalized or disempowered, including racial minorities, religious minorities, gender identity, and so forth. If hateful speech, hate speech, in a particular set of facts and circumstances poses an emergency, then it can and should be punished. And let me give you some of the subcategories of an emergency that the Supreme Court has recognized. One has gotten a lot of attention recently because of the events on January 6th in the United States, the insurrection at the US Capitol. And that is called intentional incitement of imminent violence when the violence is likely to happen imminently. So if the hateful statements that were made by Donald Trump or by some of his supporters fit that specific definition, intentional incitement of imminent violence, that's like, and I'm sorry, it's not only violence, intentional incitement of imminent violent or lawless conduct, even if it's not violent, if it's lawless conduct that is likely to happen imminently, that can and should be punished. And a lot of legal scholars and First Amendment advocates believe that Donald Trump's statements, not only on January 6th, but leading up to January 6th, do satisfy that standard and could be subject to punishment. Certainly a plausible case to that effect. Another category of hateful speech that could satisfy the emergency test is what we lawyers call a true threat. And the adjective true is put in there because to distinguish it from the way we loosely use the term threat, in everyday speech. So I speak on college campuses constantly, which in the United States, the student body is overwhelmingly liberal and anti-Trump, and students will say things like, I feel threatened by Donald Trump, by a speech that Donald Trump gave. Doesn't make Trump's speech a punishable true threat. A punishable true threat is when the speaker is directly targeting a relatively small audience, right? Small enough to be directly targeted, an individual or a small group of individuals, and the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear on the part of the audience that they are going to be subject to some kind of harm. Now, interestingly enough, the true threat to be punished, the speaker doesn't have to intend to carry out the harm. The speaker simply has to intend to instill a reasonable fear, which means it's an objective standard. Would a reasonable person in that position feel afraid? And even if the threat is not actually carried out, that already does enough harm, right? Because if you fear that you're going to be attacked, it's going to inhibit your freedom of movement and your freedom of speech. So let me give you an example that illustrates the distinction between hate speech that is protected because it's objected to solely because of its viewpoint, and hate speech that's not protected because it constitutes a true threat, using that example. And I can use the tragic situation in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, where my organization, the ACLU, in my view, correctly, as a matter of principle, came to the defense of the free speech rights of the Unite the Right white supremacist demonstrators, completely loathsome as their message is to us with our civil libertarian values. We know from experience that if the government has the power to suppress their speech because it's unpopular and feared and offensive, other government officials in other parts of the country are going to censor, as has happened, Black Lives Matter protests or Native American protests over pipelines. So we adhere to the principle, knowing that we need to defend the pro-civil liberty voices. Anyway, the judge agreed with us when there was an attempt to shut down the Unite the Right rally. There was absolutely no evidence that there were any plans to engage in violence, and the police, chief of police, all of the local government officials acknowledged that there was no such evidence and attested that they had the situation completely in control. They would prevent and protect against any violence. So the rally takes place, and as you know, with tragic consequences, including an unplanned demonstration the night before the permitted rally, where I'm sure you've seen images, I mean, horrific images of demonstrators en masse brandishing lighted tiki torches and firearms and marching upon and intimidating counter demonstrators. That clearly constituted a punishable true threat. And the police department should have protected the counter demonstrators, should have arrested the Unite the Right, should have locked them up. And I don't know to what extent you followed this. It's a U.S. issue, but I'll tell you, after those tragic events, including the car driving through counter protesters and killing one of them, Heather Heyer, injuring many others, the Charlottesville City Council did a study afterwards. Well, they commissioned a law firm to do a study, which completely condemned all of the law enforcement officials at every level, from the University of Virginia up through the FBI, saying they were completely unprepared, completely uncoordinated, didn't provide the protection that they should have provided. And, you know, again, I go back to the, you know, not that there's any comparison again to genocide, but this was the problem in the Weimar Republic, failing to protect physical safety. But I use this as an illustration of, you know, a line between between, you couldn't punish it solely because of the ideas, but when it crosses the line into a true threat, it certainly could and should be punished. Now, the arguments in favor of censorship, going beyond the kind of punishment that's allowed under US and international law, the arguments inevitably rest on the harm that is caused by hate speech. And I completely agree that even hate speech that does not satisfy the emergency principle, that does not rise to the level of punishable incitement or a punishable true threat, still can and does do enormous harm. No debate on that point. But I want to point out to you that many people who advocate censorship only argue that protected hate speech does harm. That's their argument, full stop. One prominent example is somebody I admire and respect and like a lot, Jeremy Waldron. I've debated him many times. He wrote a very famous book, and the title of his book says it all. The title of his book is The Harm in Hate Speech. And I say, yeah, there is harm in hate speech, but that alone does not justify censoring it. To make the case for censorship, logically, you would have to make several other showings. One of them is that you have to show that censorship will materially reduce the harm. Number two, you have to show that censorship is not going to have any unintended adverse impacts. Number three, you have to show that counter speech and anti-discrimination laws and hate crime laws, non-censorial tactics are not as effective or not effective enough in reducing the harm. And I think so it's the failure to, just the assumption that speech is harmful, therefore censoring the speech is going to solve the problems. That is a logical fallacy. And it's also a fallacy under US and international law, where to justify a restrictive measure, you have to show not only that it's got a positive purpose, but you have to show that it's actually effective in serving that purpose, and that no less restrictive alternative measure would as effectively promote that purpose. I also do want to say this, that the harm from hate speech is not at all inevitable. And there are two basic kinds of harm. One is that it can fuel actual discriminatory or violent conduct, and the other is that the mere utterance of the words can cause trauma to people who are disparaged or members of the groups who are disparaged. And these are very serious potential harms. I take them very seriously in terms of the emotional trauma. I have been subject to hate speech myself, and I can attest it has adverse psychological impacts, which can have a physiological manifestation. And there's a free speech concern on that side as well, right? I'm aware that hateful speech that is not subject to punishment can deter people who are the targets of it from exercising their free speech rights, right? So there's a free speech cost as well. But I absolutely am convinced that those harms are not inevitable, and we as a society must take every step we can constructively to prevent those potential harms. So for example, the fact that people are saying hateful things, espousing white supremacist philosophy, doesn't mean that everybody who hears them is going to become a white supremacist. I mean, that's insulting our intelligence. If I even look at Charlottesville as an example, I mean, words can't describe the horror of the murder that was done and the violence that was done. But in terms of what was done to promoting discrimination and discriminatory violence versus retarding it, I have absolutely no doubt that the net effect in this country was to shore up the Black Lives Matter movement, to redouble commitment to racial equality, to show that we are better than this, that the Unite the Right rally does not speak for Americans. And at the time, virtually every government official, every military official, community leaders across the country denounced the white supremacist ideology and action. And you may recall that Donald Trump was excoriated. It was one of the few times that his Republican allies in Congress criticized him. They usually just, applauded everything he did, but they criticized him because, remember, he said, oh, there are good people on both sides. And every head of every branch of the military denounced that statement, and Trump even had two major councils of leaders of CEOs of major corporations who were giving him economic advice, and they loved his tax policies, they loved his financial policies. But these CEOs of major corporations were so distressed by Trump's failure to sufficiently condemn the white supremacists that they disbanded both of those organizations. And then around the country, we had spontaneous grassroots groups mobilizing to against hatred, and with ongoing impact. I can speak from the little town where I'm fortunate to have a weekend home, and church groups and other community groups are still in the wake of Charlottesville, redoubling their efforts to promote equality and, the e pluribus unum, one out of many ideal of America. And what about in terms of the emotional and psychic and traumatic harm that can come from hate speech? That too is not inevitable. And I say this, I don't expect everybody who is the subject to hateful speech to be able to withstand it. I certainly have been crushed by it myself, but I do believe from my own experience, and much more importantly, from reading psychological experts, mental health experts, that all of us can learn habits of mind, resiliency, so that we don't cede the power to those who are trying to bring us down with their hateful words. We're above that. It reminds me a little bit of Michelle Obama saying, when they go low, we go high. We look down on them. Who are they to think they can bring us down with their hateful words? And interestingly enough, a lot of mental health experts have suggested, for example, the skills that are associated with cognitive behavioral therapy, and recommended that this should be taught to all college students. And I really, and also political activists, including minority group leaders in this country, some leaders of the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movement have also espoused that they want to empower women and members of racial minorities to, rise above, resist the attempts by other people to inflict emotional trauma on them. Now, I really, really, really want to stress that by saying that, I am not at all blaming the victim. So, if you do feel disparaged and silenced, I completely understand why. And it's not your responsibility as somebody who is disparaged by hate speech to be the one to resist it. The rest of us have that moral obligation. All of us who oppose hatred and support equality have a constant proactive obligation to raise our voices in every possible way that we can. And the options for counter speech are literally infinite. We have to be very strategic about what we do in any particular situation to make sure that we're not unintendedly giving more voice to those that we are trying to silence. So experts in this area have said, for example, that when college students try to shout down or deplatform a hateful speaker, it may give them a sense of moral satisfaction, but it may not be the most strategic step, because these people are seeking the attention that the media will give them when there's a controversy. And maybe the most effective thing in a particular situation is to ignore them, or have your own positive, affirmative event in a different part of campus that is affirmatively celebrating the positive values of diversity and equality and so forth. So I'm looking at the clock now, and I see I only have a couple of minutes left. And in those couple of minutes, I'd like to say that in addition to the retail types of counter speech, education, debates, discussion, positive information about groups that are traditionally subject to discrimination, I think of that as kind of the wholesale, mass distribution of information. There's also a retail or a one-on-one exchange, and one of the things that I have been so moved by are the people who generously, online and offline, will engage one-on-one with individual hate mongers, even leaders of hate monger organizations, who have been able to redeem them. That's the term they use, wean them away from their hateful ideologies. And you don't do that by making somebody a criminal, by throwing them in prison, as happens in some countries. You don't do it by ostracizing them, deplatforming them, shouting at them, as happens in my country. It's not guaranteed that it's going to work, but certainly if you don't try, it's not going to happen. And that is to engage with these people with empathy and compassion for them as human beings, not for their ideology. And there are really famous examples of people who were leaders of really hateful organizations who were redeemed with the help of generous people who engaged with them patiently. They've written books and memoirs about this. They've given TED Talks about it. They're dedicating their lives to stopping other people from following in their tracks. And so let me end by quoting one of my great heroes, Martin Luther King, who, like almost all leaders of the civil rights movement in the United States and leaders for racial justice throughout our history, including abolitionists, have all strongly supported free speech and opposed censorship for a number of reasons, including that they knew that their speech would be the one that was targeted under any law, right? Why did Martin Luther King write his famous letter from a Birmingham jail? Because his speech that was advocating desegregation and racial equality was seen as hateful and offensive and dangerous in the communities where he was trying to demonstrate. But King also emphasized the affirmative power and responsibility that all of us have to raise our voices. And he said, in the long run, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So I say to all friends of equality and justice, thank you for not being silent.